Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Cade, and for today's episode, we are going to be covering the Terminator franchise. And for most of this discussion, we're going to be comparing the first two films and the other sequels in the franchise, and really talking about where we think they went wrong. And for today's episode, I'm joined by a returning guest for the channel, and that is my friend Max. And if you haven't checked out Max's channel already, we'll leave a link for that in the description. Max, thanks so much for being here, man.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I'm so ready to talk about Terminator. I recently just kind of binged watched them again, and yeah, it's they're still not there's such a noticeable decline in the quality of the story after T2.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that. But first thing I wanted to ask you about is what your relationship is with the first two movies in the franchise, because you have Terminator 1 from 1984, and then we have Terminator 2 Judgment Day from 91. And I'm curious, when it comes to the action genre and the sci-fi genre, where do the first two films sit with you personally as an audience member?
So I am like kind of new to Terminator. I didn't really get into it till later on, but my relationship with Terminator actually started with when my mom rented a copy of Jurassic Park. You know how like old VHS movies had to have like trailers before them? So my mom was like, "You're gonna be really afraid of Jurassic Park." And I was not afraid of Jurassic Park at all. But what I was afraid of was there was an ad for the Terminator before Jurassic Park to like rent Terminator. And at the end of the ad, like I think the Terminator exploded and the skull of the Terminator flew at the screen because I think it was trying to promote like a 3D version of it. And I remember that scared me. And for the rest of so and that and since I was three, the skull of the Terminator was always like burned into my mind. So when I realized what it was when I was older, I was like, "Oh yeah, that frightened me as a kid. I was afraid of the Terminator. Like the cardboard cutouts they'd have in blockbusters, I'd stay away from them. They actually scared me."
Yeah, I totally get it. And actually, here's something that I've seen online a couple times, and it keeps me thinking every time I revisit the first movie specifically. So I've seen people say that the first Terminator could be considered a slasher film or a horror film, which I guess I can kind of see where they're coming from if you kind of look at it from that perspective, but I don't really consider it a slasher film. I mean, maybe it could be considered a sci-fi horror from some perspective, but I don't know, have you ever had that opinion of the movie?
No, I mean it is kind of strange. Like you do until like they start getting into the future part, kind of wondering why Arnold Schwarzenegger kills those punks in the beginning, and then he shows up to that lady's house and guns her down. And you know when Sarah Connor's roommate and her boyfriend get murdered, that is kind of like slasher aspect, and maybe that's what James Cameron kind of wanted to fake you out. But I never, when I watched Terminator again recently, I never really got like, oh, this is a slasher. It's not really a slasher. It's more of a, that's just the way they're setting up. And I think for the time, maybe when they didn't have to compare anything else, Terminator 2, they didn't really have anything like that. So yeah, maybe the closest thing was a slasher film, but I think Terminator is just kind of its own film and kind of takes part in that style of sci-fi where you have that kind of like the final girl, which is a horror trope. And I think Sarah Connor kind of follows more around that vibes. So I guess if you had to compare, they're similar, but I always thought Terminator's so unique. I think it's its own thing.
Well, and believe it or not, Max, I don't know if you knew this already, but that's actually kind of how it started out when James Cameron came up with this movie. His initial idea for Terminator was actually inspired from a nightmare that he had in which he saw a chrome skeleton emerging from flames. And apparently, that skeleton was actually holding kitchen knives. And yeah, he started to develop that concept after that. And believe it or not, he was inspired by John Carpenter's work, specifically with Halloween. And it actually started out as a slasher style film before it evolved into what it was.
Oh, I think you know what? I do recall watching a YouTube video about Cameron's nightmare and his inspiration for Terminator, because that's always interesting, and how his ex-wife actually owned the rights to the first script and then by proxy the whole franchise, because that was the only way he could get the movie made back in the day, which is something I always found fascinating. Cameron had a good vision for the first two movies. Obviously, he didn't stick around for three onward. He kind of had a hand in fate, but not really. Yeah, I always I do think that getting inspired by a nightmare like that, like I've never had a nightmare that's that vivid, that I'm seeing something I've never seen before. That is definitely a good source of inspiration.
Yeah, I think it really just shows the imagination that James Cameron has as a creative.
Yeah.
Well, and when it comes to the first Terminator and also the second movie, do you think that they are some of the greatest films of the action and sci-fi genre that you've ever seen?
Oh yeah. I definitely think so. I mean, you have to look past Arnold Schwarzenegger being a really good action hero, and you got to look at like the stunt choreography too is amazing in those movies. And you would think like go back and watch T2. Like this is like prime. They're just starting CGI in this era. So like the biggest thing graphically and special effects is the T1000. But you look at like the car chase scenes or when the T1000 has to chase John Connor on foot, like the actor was running, actually running. Like there was no special effects for that. And they actually they had to redo the scene a couple times because he was running too fast for the cameraman to keep up with him. But yeah, I just remember watching T2 and especially when the scene where the truck goes over the bridge, you're like, "Oh my gosh. Like how do you do that?"
Yeah, and one other thing that we have the first movie to thank is that it gave us arguably one of the greatest lines in the history of cinema, "I'll be back."
Yeah.
Which what I find funny is how Arnold actually didn't like that line when they were filming it, how he said to James Cameron, I don't know, to me it just sounds weird when I say I'll be back. What if I said I will be back because it sounded more machine-like, which James Cameron just said, no.
Yeah, James Cameron was not happy. He was did not he I think, persisting on I'll be back is good because I also think it really kind of also set the tone for the type of machine a Terminator is, which is it doesn't waste time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and one thing that I think Terminator does really well that not all action movies suffer from, but I think some of them do, is helping us get attached to characters. And in this movie specifically, I think they did a good job getting us attached to characters like Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese. And part of that was because both actors played off each other really well, and they were both great in their performances. But it's something that I think James Cameron deserves a lot of credit for because one thing I've noticed when I look at his work is that he's usually really good when it comes to characters, giving them certain characteristics and making them stand out from each other, and also making them people who you can root for.
Yeah, I definitely everybody in the Terminator T1 and T2 have really unique characteristics. I really like how they treat Kyle Reese as some delusional homeless man because like who wouldn't treat Kyle Reese like that if he's claiming to be from the future and he's being stalked by a machine. I like how he kind of characterizes the Terminator as it has a logic of the past. Like when he's shopping in the gun shop, he references a weapon that Terminators only use, and it kind of throws out an idea like, so does the Terminator did they make a mistake, or does it actually, or did logically by the Terminator's own logic did that weapon exist but wasn't in the hands of the public in that franchise yet? Another character I really love that he appears in the second movie and in T3 very briefly is the psychologist character. I actually really liked the way that Cameron wrote him and how he had no concern for Sarah Connor. He just wanted to write like the next big psychology piece, the next big piece of research, and how karma kind of gets him in the end because the T1000 kind of mentally breaks his concept of reality once it phases through the cage.
Yeah, and I think that one thing about Terminator 1 compared to Terminator 2, just before we really get into Terminator 2, there's often this huge debate about which movie's better. Is it the first one? Is it the second one? And I'm curious, for you personally, which movie do you prefer? Because I like Terminator 2 just a little bit better, but I still think Terminator 1 is really great.
I definitely was more engaged with Terminator 2. Not that Terminator 1 has problems with holding your attention, because Terminator 1 has some great moments, like the actual Terminator, once Arnold is gone, it's just the Terminator, like the skeleton walking through the factory. It's so uncanny valley, like that's a really good moment in T1. But T2 has a lot of show don't tell. So like watching the T1000 operate and following John Connor and then watching the T800, all those characters collide is just I think it was more I was just more enthralled, and I think the movie had a bigger focus on this chase, this action, and the Sarah Connor escaping from the mental institution. There's just so many big set pieces in T2 that it's just really memorable and I think really more engaging than what T1 had to offer. But T1 was also the first of the franchise, so T1 definitely I think played it a bit more safe. So the movie was possible.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to Terminator 2, one of the things that I like about it as a sequel is, I mean, does it have certain elements that are similar to the first one? Absolutely. But the narrative isn't completely the same as what the first movie was. You know, it's not just about survival, it's also about stopping Judgment Day from happening. And what you were saying, you know, show don't tell. They don't just talk about what Judgment Day will be like, they also show us, you know, we see that scene from Sarah Connor's perspective where she sees the missiles striking down and everything just incinerating.
Yeah,
And you also have the T-1000, which is a much more advanced Terminator when compared to the original. So, yeah, I mean, it has similar elements from the first one for sure, but it's different enough to stand on its own, in my opinion.
exactly. I think the Judgment Day scene, in air quotes, is that's a really good scene, and I think it really helps build Sarah Connor, build the audience into believing Sarah Connor's paranoia that Judgment Day is coming. Because instead of just her freaking out, screaming Judgment Day is coming, we see kind of what her mind sees, and we kind of also get paranoid after that.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of Sarah Connor, you know, one of the things that's definitely a highlight for this movie would have to be the characters. Because first off, you have the trio of Sarah, John, and the Terminator. And when you have someone like Sarah, you know, she's come a long way from the first movie, both as a survivor and as this warrior. And what I also like is how completely unhinged and cynical she is in this movie. And believe it or not, that's one of the things that Linda Hamilton wanted with her character when they were making the movie. Because, you know, I don't know if you know about this, when James Cameron reached out to her and said, "Hey, we want to do another Terminator." She told him, you know, she wanted her character to be crazy, which James Cameron said, "Hey, I can do that." I liked seeing that side of her character because I think it made a lot of sense based on what she went through in the first movie and the years since.
Yeah, I think that it was the most logical progression for Sarah Connor was to be a semi-conspiracy theorist in the eyes of the public. This conspiracy theorist, I think also a terrorist because she got arrested before the events of the movie because she tried to blow up a factory. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but also it shows just how much the events of Terminator 1 has affected Sarah Connor. Because the beginning of Terminator 1, she's just a 19-year-old waitress, late for her shift at the diner, and now she is this living off the grid future revolutionist against the uprising of a like a machine army that's going to somehow destroy mankind. And I think the way Linda Hamilton plays Sarah Connor, she made it so believable. Like you would think that like you met Sarah Connor in real life, you'll be like, oh my God, she's crazy. And that's exactly what they were going for. And I think Linda Hamilton, I'm honestly surprised that I don't see her in more films because she's so good in T2.
Well, and aside from Sarah, you also have John, who forms a very strong bond with the Terminator, and that's one of my favorite aspects of the movie. You know, I think Edward Furlong does a really great job as the young John Connor, and I think that he and Arnold played off each other really well in this, and that really added to their dynamic. Speaking of which, I really like Arnold in this movie. I like him a little bit better in this than the first movie because I think that he definitely gets way more to do and he definitely had more characters to interact with. So I think that's what, you know, I think his co-stars kind of brought the best out of him in that way.
Yeah, I do like the fact that, well, this Terminator, this T-800 is sent back by future John Connor, hacked by future John Connor. He has to protect this John Connor and is also pre-programmed to take orders from past John Connor. And that the past John Connor is, while he's still like a rebellious young boy, he doesn't, he tells the Terminator he can't kill anyone. And the Terminator has to kind of fight against its own like Skynet programming in that sense, where he doesn't think it's logical to leave people alive, but he also has to obey the future John Connor's orders. And one of my favorite scenes is where he has to teach the Terminator to act natural, so he tries to get him to smile, but he can't smile properly. They just kind of have to accept that he has an awkward smile.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of my favorite parts of the entire movie is, you know, the trio, but also just the dynamic between John and the Terminator. You're not really gonna find a dynamic like that in this franchise ever again, I don't think.
No, I think it's just like once you do it, you can't really do that again because then everyone's going to be expecting the exact same thing that would happen in T2. And I feel like the franchise has tried to recreate that, but not to a whole lot of success.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more in a little while.
Yeah.
But one other thing I wanted to talk about with you is, I mean, we got to talk about the T-1000. So, yeah, first off, Robert Patrick, I think, is great in the role, but I've always just loved the whole concept of the T-1000. You know, you have this liquid metal Terminator Terminator that can shapeshift its hands into weapons, who can also mimic the people that it touches. It's just a very inventive concept, and I think that for the most part, the CGI for the T-1000 still holds up incredibly well to this day, 34 years later. It's something that I can totally just picture James Cameron being the one creating.
Yeah, the T-1000 really impressive for 91. Very impressive for 91. Came out before the original Jurassic Park, which was 93. So like we're just seeing like the tip of the iceberg of what computers are capable of to add to special effects. And to have like one of the, I guess, the first real big examples be a human that can melt and turn into other people. Yeah, it is kind of being like, oh my God, it's so ambitious for that time, works so well, and is so frightening because it plays into the paranoia of being watched constantly. Or one of my like one of the more iconic scenes where they're talking to the foster parents on the phone and the T-1000 slips up by answering one of the questions wrong. And also a really good piece of detail there is that in the first movie, Kyle Reese in the future has to hold his hand up to a dog so it sniffs him. If it doesn't bark, he can go into the survivor camp. And then the dogs bark when they sense a Terminator. In that scene where they're talking to the T-1000 disguised as the foster mom, you can hear the dog barking in the back. Then the camera pulls out to the wider shot of the T-1000's blade arm going through the skull of the foster dad. And I remember when I saw that for the first time, I was really freaked out. I was like, oh my God.
Really, I thought the part that was freaky was when the T-1000 just straight up impales the foster dad with the half
Yeah.
carton of milk just still drinking from it.
Yeah, it's so freaky. But yeah, I would say like that the T-1000 could easily, if it wasn't in an action movie, I think it could also be a crazy horror monster, a robot that can just shift its form into anyone, a doppelganger.
Yeah, and I think, before we get into the other sequels, one other thing I wanted to mention is part of why I enjoy this movie a little bit more than the first one is when it comes to the action. So I think the action is definitely an improvement over the first one. And don't get me wrong, the first movie had great action. I'm not gonna argue with that. But I think that the action in the second movie is a little bit more thrilling. You were talking about the truck sequence or the scene where Arnold is just using the gun, just mowing everything down, or the action scenes at the hospital, or just even the end when they're fighting the T-1000. Yeah, it's definitely a step up from the first movie. And like I said, it feels a lot more thrilling and engaging than the first one.
Yeah, I think it's just because they pace it out really well, but they also don't allow you for much time to get relaxed because they always hit certain beats right. And I think that's always like another great scene that I don't see a lot of people talk about, but it's a crazy scene. I like when the T-1000 stabs into the police car that when they're trying to get away and they knock him off and they have to like reach over and take the piece of metal out of the car because he's still technically on the car. That's a great scene. Like you said, the minigun scene's really cool because he has the non-lethal order at that scene. So he uses that minigun, doesn't kill a single police officer, and you don't have to like suspend your disbelief for that scene. Like, oh, how does he not hit anyone? Because A, he's a robot, and B, it like shows you without trying to explain it away. Like he's hitting all the cars, and it's just a really good scene that can still make sense to the narrative. And I think it's really interesting that it's an action movie where very little people die, but then you have the Skynet scene that's crazy, and they blow up a part of Skynet towards the end of the movie. That scene's great, especially with the programmer or when Sarah Connor goes after him and shoots up his house. That's another great moment.
Yeah, and I think before we move on to the other sequels in the franchise, I just wanted to talk about part of what I think just the main thing that separates the first two films from the rest of them. What I think it is that the first two, what made them stand out so much is how different they were. And I think that the first two were definitely the most ambitious movies in the entire franchise. I know that's probably arguable, but meanwhile, when you get to the other sequels, most of them were kind of just rehashing ideas that were already explored in the first two movies, and they weren't really explored in very different or emotional or super in-depth ways. And we'll get into that more, but I think that's part of where the sequels started to go wrong, before we get into those.
Yeah, it's definitely Cameron has a vision for Terminator, and I think it's one of those visions that are so specific that I don't think a lot of people would be able to find out where he wanted to take Terminator. And I also know that he was pretty okay with Terminator's story ending at T2, and he wasn't too interested in helping Terminator further. I know that it's back in his hands now, so he might make another one, but it's just like you think you know where Terminator's going. And I think it's very clear that we don't. And that if we need more Terminator, it needs to come from Cameron's mind because it's very clearly every other person who's tried their shot at Terminator, they hit the stuff that we know, but we rehash the stuff because there's actually just not enough original Terminator from Cameron to go around and actually make a movie that people would enjoy. Because there's something that he did not express with Terminator or go deep into enough to really make sense of the Terminator lore and canon. And I think that's why we need at least one more Cameron Terminator before I think people can start safely producing Terminator movies that aren't just rehashes of the first two.
Yeah, and I'll actually have something to say about that when we get to the end of this, so be prepared for that. Well, now moving on to the next one, we have Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines.
Oh, Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines.
Yeah,
We look at Terminator 2, and their whole thing is that the future is not set, but Terminator 3 totally goes against that. The future's totally set because the T-850 says that you only stop Skynet from destroying the world, but you only delayed the inevitable, which means the future was set the whole time. Skynet was always going to take over, and I hated that reveal because I was like, that doesn't make sense. That goes against Cameron's whole message.
well, I mean, it's a movie, man. They can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it is movies. They can change everything. I just remember being like, first off, T3, very hard movie to find on streaming services. Like, no one has it. Second off, it's just T2 again, but with an older John Connor.
Who isn't as fun to follow as we saw in the second one.
No. And then a part of me just like it's confusing. So they go back and so the TX goes back in time and starts killing members of the future resistance. And logically, I feel like that should start altering the reality of the future and maybe playing some things in the past. But ultimately, the scenes where the TX kills people from the past, it just doesn't go anywhere for the rest of the movie because it has to kill John Connor and his future wife. And like obviously it's not going to happen because John Connor is protected because of the way that the franchise goes. And so T3 just kind of you sit there for most of the movie being like, all right, where are we going with this? There's some cool stunt choreography. Like I know that Arnold did hold on to that crane arm in that one scene where he gets kind of dragged through the building, which is always cool. And the action isn't bad in that movie. It's just
It's kind of a step down from what we saw in Terminator 2.
yeah, and I feel like it doesn't go anywhere, and then they have to explain why Sarah Connor's not in the movie, and that's the whole reason they're at the graveyard is that she has a stash of weapons in her casket, but it's also just to explain why Sarah Connor's not in the movie. And the only thing that is at all good about the movie is that it kind of gets you with a ah, ha ha, Skynet wins, and you're like, what? All right, I guess so. But I kind of liked the twist a little bit. I just didn't really know how to feel about it.
Well, one of the issues that I've seen a lot of people have with this movie and the sequels after Terminator 1 and 2, myself included, is, and I don't know if you feel this way, but to me, it felt that they started to put more focus on action over story. And if you look at the first two films, those, in my opinion, did such a great job balancing story with the action. When you get to the sequels, starting with this one, I think the action started getting way more focused than the overall narrative. And because of that, I think that the sequels started to lose the emotional depth that the first two films had.
Yeah, I thought it's there's noticeable drop off in characters. They feel so flat in comparison. And yeah, it is kind of like a T3 feels like it's a victim of competition because Arnold Schwarzenegger had to be in a bunch of action movies to compete with other Hollywood actors who were action stars. And they're like, let's just make T3 this action movie. And so the story really suffers in T3. So all the interesting ideas T3 has, it doesn't have any layering to it. It's just John Connor lives off the grid. In the future, which is another problem, is that in the future he gets killed by the T-850 because he trusted the T-800 back in the day. I always had a problem with that because it's just like, wait, but wouldn't he know it's like he shouldn't expect that to be a friendly Terminator, but it still got him. So that was always an issue I had with that movie.
Yeah, and that's kind of something that I've noticed about this franchise, revisiting it. So I don't know if you've ever noticed this, Max, but is it me or is this franchise just really obsessed obsessed with killing off John Connor.
Yeah.
In this movie, we find out, oh yeah, you're gonna die in the future by this Terminator, and then in Terminator Salvation, he comes close to dying, but he gets saved at the end. But then you get to Terminator Genisys, he dies, becomes this new Terminator, the T-3000, and then in Terminator Dark Fate, he just gets killed off in the first 4 to 5 minutes. I don't get why these movies are so obsessed with killing off John Connor.
Yeah, it's just like he's the chosen one of Terminator. We've spent now three movies emphasizing his importance, and the other newer movies seem to be like he's not that important actually. And I'm like, I just don't. I have a hard time buying it when, especially when Terminator 1 and 2 really hammered the point home that he's the key to humanity's salvation. And it's all right to have that savior character, or as like, or the guy that will save everyone. I think that's a fine trope. It's not a bad trope, and it's always just established that like he's not going to be the only one that saves us, but he's the one that logically in Terminator is the only one who can lead a united front. I think always the feeling I got. And so when they always change, they try to kill him or they change his motives, it doesn't make sense to me, and I don't buy it.
Yeah, and I hated that they made him a villain in Terminator Genisys.
Yeah, I didn't like that.
But with this movie specifically, you have an older John Connor played by Nick Stahl, and I don't want to blame Nick Stahl for this, because he's just doing what the script told him to do. But I've never really been a fan of this version of John Connor. He's just not as fun to follow as the John that we saw in the second movie, and I didn't really care about his relationship with Kate Brewster. Their dynamic just wasn't as strong for me to get invested in it. Also, most importantly, John in this movie, his dynamic just wasn't as strong with Arnold as it was in the second one. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying, you're not really going to find something like that again. So I think that's what it suffers from.
Yeah, and I think that Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't want to do T3, but Cameron convinced him to just take the check, just demand a lot of money and do the film. And he had a lot of control. But a lot of that movie, I feel like he's the least interested cast member there, is to be there. He does not, he's just there for the money, and he is protected over the Terminator. But he has, and I think those movies are worse than T3, but he has generally better performances in Genesis and in Dark Fate, and I don't like him in T3. I think he's boring in T3, and I think he's it's the worst version of the Terminator. And Stahl John Connor feels like he should be developing into the leader of the revolution at this point, and he doesn't do that. He doesn't really develop as a character, and he goes ultimately nowhere as a character and just feels like Sarah Connor 2.5.
And he doesn't even seem like the same character that we saw in the second movie.
Yeah, exactly. It's just I just don't know how we go from the John Connor who says that fate isn't set to the John Connor who's breaking into a veterinarian's to steal dog medicine to because he crashed his motorcycle. I know he's got to stay off the grid, but I feel like logically this was the least logical progression for John Connor other than Genesis, which we'll get into later.
Yeah, I mean, I never expected that John Connor would have a great life after Terminator 2, but every time I go back to 3, I just think, really? That's the best you got for John?
Yeah, he's not that interesting in 3.
Well, in this movie, like you said, also kills off Sarah Connor between the events of the second one and this one. And of all the ways that she could have been killed off, it happens off screen. So, Linda Hamilton was actually in talks to return for this movie, but she felt the second movie really wrapped up her character's arc so well. So she felt that returning wouldn't do her justice, which, I mean, okay, I get that. I mean, if they couldn't bring her back, then they couldn't get her back. That's just what it is. But after everything that Sarah went through in the first two films, and then for us to just find out, oh yeah, she's dead, she dies off screen, that just never seemed like a fitting end for Sarah. And every time I go back to this movie and we find, oh yeah, she's dead, all I can think is, oh, okay, just like that. All right, fine.
Yeah, I know from behind the scenes that she was in the original script, but she get killed by the TX snaps her neck at one point, and Linda Hamilton didn't like that death because she died halfway through the script, and then the characters sort of just move on from that. Just like you said, you're like, oh, okay, that happens now. Same, I guess, the same energy is that she dies and there's no scene to mourn her. They just kind of have to leave her because it was in a facility, so her body gets destroyed from what Linda Hamilton was referencing. She didn't like that death. She didn't agree with it. They wouldn't change it. So she said no to the movie, and they had to change the scene to the graveyard scene and kill her off screen. And it's still very much, it goes to show how sometimes you need to be a lot more protective over your properties. Obviously, Cameron didn't have the rights to Terminator.
Well, and I think that Arnold tried to convince Cameron that maybe they should both just buy the rights to the franchise, but, Cameron wasn't interested, so.
Yeah, and I think that T3 suffers from the let's just make another Terminator. People love Terminator. There's a lot of creative decisions that leave the movie in this forgettable state. Because I remember being like, was there a Terminator 3? And or did they go right from T2 to Salvation? And I remember Googling it and like, oh yeah, T3, The Rise of Machines. Because like my first exposure to Terminator movies before streaming was like you had to catch them on like Spike TV.
Well, and one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Max, is regarding the villain of this movie, the TX. This might be a really unpopular opinion, I don't know, but when it came to the concept of the TX and how it could control other machines, I always kind of thought that that was kind of an interesting concept and that it had potential. I mean, you have a Terminator that can control other machines. I don't know, it's just always an idea that I think had potential and I think it was kind of cool. And if it was executed a little better, I think it could have made for an interesting new Terminator.
I'll agree with you on that, Kate. I think the TX is definitely one of the best parts of the movie. I know that it affected that actress's career, which she didn't get a lot of roles after that. But I thought she was honestly, I thought to me, I was like, she's doing the best out of everyone here. Like she's playing a machine, she's doing everything right. They just do a lot of weird logical things with her controlling machines. Like she takes over a bunch of cop cars and she doesn't ever like, I don't know, I feels like the TX in the script doesn't use the powers in a more logical sense because they have to keep the movie going. So you're like, if it can control machines, why doesn't it make all the cars in the cop chase that she takes over? Why don't they all just like catch up and like go really fast? But because it's an action sequence, it's a movie, they have to do certain stuff. I mean, they obviously liked the idea of TX because they rehash it later on. Yeah, Terminator 3 is it's just one of those movies where you're like to really talk about it, you have to really dig into the about it because like it's not horrible, just kind of like in the middle of
It just kind of exists.
yeah. I mean, there's like no one's streaming it. You have to, like I said, you either have to like find something that will rent it like on like through Amazon. And yeah, I mean like that's Terminator 3. That's its a legacy. It's not super popular. No one really cares for it. No one's gonna buy the streaming rights for it. It just kind of sits in limbo.
Yeah, but moving on from that, now we have Terminator Salvation. I'm going to be honest with you, Max, and if you disagree with me and think I'm full of shit, that's totally fine. I don't have a lot to say about Terminator Salvation. It's never really had any real impact on me. I know it's a film that a lot of fans really hate, and there are some people who defend it. I mean, do I think it's the weakest film in the franchise? No, but again, it's just never had any real impact on me. It's not on the same quality as the first two films. I don't know. What's your opinion on it?
Kate, you're not full of shit. Terminator Salvation is a movie that starts off pretty strong, and by the end of it, you're like, this is going on for too long, dude. You have to end this. A lot of weird concepts. I think, in my opinion, really good characterization of Kyle Reese, but that is definitely the actor who played him was really good at that, being able to work with that script. But the guy that's actually a Terminator
Marcus, right?
Marcus Wright, and he has a human heart. Like he only has the human heart to save John Connor at the end. That's the whole reason he has a human heart. He's apparently like a proto Terminator, so they needed the heart. And then they have the scene I remember being like, how did they let that happen? Was when they're in the gas station and then the giant Terminator grabs a bunch of people. Like, how did no one like they messed up that scene so bad because it's a big Terminator and it sneaks up on everyone and grabs them? How did it do that?
Because the script said so.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's script logic and like it's always like it's no fun to nitpick movies, but it's also like really like that scene just made me go, huh, they didn't hear it coming. And then there's a really noticeable scene where like the little girl that's with him gets like knocked over by an explosion and it's clearly just a dummy in her clothes and he carries her like with one arm, the Terminator, and it's so bad. I do like Salvation's Terminators. I think those things are really cool. I really like I like that it's in the future war, but there's also not a whole lot to say about Salvation other than that movie was troubled from the start. It was supposed to be a trilogy, but Christian Bale had some problems during production, and then the movie didn't make enough money. So they weren't going to bring it back, and they were going to try to get Bale back for like Genesis, but he's like, I don't want to do this anymore. So he didn't come back. And Salvation also sits in like movie limbo. Like you can just watch it on YouTube with ads.
Well, I will say this, Max. I think that Christian Bale did his best as John Connor, and that's one thing I've noticed about Christian Bale is that even when he's in a movie that isn't very good, he himself is never doing a bad job. And that's something that I credit him for as an actor.
Yeah, I like Christian Bale's John Connor, but the whole me and a buddy were talking about this recently about Christian Bale as John Connor. John Connor should be like an everyman type guy, and the actor that should play John Connor, I think, works best when you don't know that actor very well because it allows you to kind of it makes him more believable as this uniter of the resistance, like he's just the guy. But when you look at when they make it like a prominent actor playing John Connor, it's hard to like buy into that idea of him more because now you're like now for because most of Salvation, I would say I'd be like, oh my God, it's Christian Bale, not oh it's John Connor. But no, now I just think it's Christian Bale playing John Connor, and I think that John Connor is such a the way he's described in the first two movies and how he has that little appearance, and I think T2 when he's looking onto the battlefield, like you don't know that actor, and I think that works really well. And I think that's the style of casting you need to go with John Connor. So I think that he's just this action hero in Salvation. It doesn't actually really work for the character.
But also, just regarding the overall plot of this movie, I mean, it's about the human resistance versus the machines. And the problem is that pretty much most of the characters, if not all of them in this movie, are pretty bland and not really that fun to follow, which is too bad because I actually really like the cast of this movie. I mean, you got Christian Bale, there's Sam Worthington, Bryce Dallas Howard, you got Common, even Helena Bonham Carter's in this movie too. And they're all there, but most of them aren't really utilized that well. And like I said, that's mainly because there just isn't really anything memorable about these characters. And I think that they didn't really have too much to work with.
Yeah, I feel like Salvation script feels like draft two. Like there was a draft one, we got the draft two. Oh, we have to make the movie. There's no depth with Helena Bonham Carter's character. You wouldn't even know she's in the movie.
Yeah, and Bryce Dallas Howard's character, Kate Brewster, is just there.
Yeah, Kate's just there. So you have Moon Bloodgood, and she plays one of the characters, resistant. She plays a resistance member, but the thing is that resistance member died in T3. So did T3's plot happen or not? Or is this before T3's plot?
I have no idea, man. There are so many timelines in this
Yeah,
franchise.
but it does. The movie starts in 2003 when the missiles fall, so it's technically a sequel to T3, but also maybe not, or maybe the TX hasn't gotten sent back yet. But there's just a lot of like I don't know where this movie falls. Is it its own thing? It was supposed to be its own trilogy, and kind of like T3, like I said a couple times already. It's just it's in movie limbo. It doesn't really make it didn't leave an impact. It didn't make the money that the studios wanted, so it just sat there as oh, this is Terminator Salvation, our failed attempt, and they didn't make another Terminator until Genisys.
I honestly think when you start a first movie, I don't think it's right to just automatically say, hey, this is going to be the first movie in a new trilogy. No, I think you should always just wait to see how that one does and then, yeah, wait.
Yes, that's the problem with the new Terminator movies. They always sequel bait, and you're like, no, you gotta send that off like it's the only one, and if people love it, we'll get another one. If they don't, then you can be like, oh, it was just the one. You can just play it. You're like, well, at least that story is a conclusion. But if you don't conclude some of that story in the first movie, like every other Terminator sequel past T3 does, you don't really you go nowhere fast.
Yeah, and I think that was also the case with Genesis and Dark Fate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially with Dark Fate and Genesis.
Well, and speaking of which, now moving on from Salvation, now we have Terminator Genisys.
Oh, that movie. I watched someone give that movie an 8 out of 10. And I will tell you, if you buy into that nostalgia, that movie throws nostalgia at your face because you're like, remember Terminator 1 and 2? What do we put them together? And it's Jai Courtney, Arnold's back,
Amelia Clark.
Amelia Clark is Sarah Connor. Like, how could you go wrong? Very wrong. Genesis's timeline makes no sense.
Yeah, honestly, my favorite thing about Genesis is probably Arnold as the older Terminator, or AKA Pops. It was kind of fun to see him portray that side of the Terminator, just in my opinion, especially when you see how close he is to Sarah and how he's become this, sort of father figure to her. But that's really all the good I have to say about the movie.
Yeah, I would feel like Terminator Genisys has a good idea for a plot that it doesn't use. Why do we rehash Terminator 1 into T2 and they jump around all around the timeline while they're getting chased by the evil John Connor? Which, by the way, I think if John Connor got infected by a Terminator, he wouldn't just concede. So I think it's very out of character for John Connor to do that. The whole idea of of the Terminators being like, what if we went back in time when Sarah Connor was a kid? to kill her. And then they killed the parents, but then there's a Terminator that goes back to save her. That is inherently a more interesting plot for Terminator Genisys than the actual plot of Terminator Genisys. I would have liked that way better, but they did this weird nostalgia timeline shattering, just an evil John Connor trying to allow Skynet to become a thing, and it's just a way it disrespects the idea of what John Connor is. It disrespects the idea of Sarah Connor. It ruins it pretty much nullifies her role in the first two movies, and they try to build Kyle Reese up with a way more important role to the franchise than he already had. And like they always go back to Kyle Reese, and if they want to make him a more interesting character, they already did that in Salvation when he was young, but then they try to action movie starify him, and it's just not that interesting.
Well, and part of the issue is that the plot can't really figure out what to do with him, I think is the problem, because the plot of this movie is just so hard to follow. It's just so convoluted. I mean, we have all these different timelines. We see Kyle Reese in the original Terminator getting sent back to 1984, where it starts off as a recreation of the original film. And then we find out, oh, yeah, no, this is an alternate version slash timeline of 1984, where Sarah Connor met the Terminator when she was 9. And then Kyle and Sarah travel to the future in an alternate 2017. And we learn Kyle has all these memories from two different timelines with information on Genesis. What?
Yeah, it's
What is happening?
it is like what do you mean? T1000s in 1984. So are you telling me that they could have always sent the T1000, but they're like, let's send the T800 first, or did a different one will go like, let's just send the T8. It always implies that the T1000 could have always gotten sent back to 1984. So that's confusing. Also, the T1000 can reactivate a destroyed T800, which is new, and then you have the T3000. It's just keeps building, and you're like, where are you going with this? Okay, so and it turns out like you think there's multiple timelines, but it's like technically one timeline. It's just the future is echoing back to the past. So that Genesis that so Skynet, once it reveals itself as Genesis, it still gets thwarted in the end. But then everyone has a time traveling portal. They make one in 1984. There's the one in the future, and then there's the one in 2014. It's like, what is happening? We have portals everywhere.
Well, and I have to say this, Max, one of my biggest issues with this movie has always been the relationship between Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor. Now, again, just like with Christian Bale, I think Jai Courtney and Emilia Clarke did their best with what they had, but their dynamic wasn't as strong as the Kyle and Sarah that we saw in the very first movie. And because of that, just in my opinion, it was really difficult to get invested in their relationship.
Yeah, Jai Courtney does not have the same like Michael Biehn plays Kyle Reese like a like he in as a man who's only known a world where robots have taken over, and logically when he goes back to 1984 acts like an absolute lunatic. It makes sense, but he also has that covert way of like being able to hide from the eyes of the public. Like he follows Sarah Connor around for a long time. You don't even get that with the Jai Courtney Kyle Reese. He just kind of they retrace the steps up until when he hides in the little clothing part of the mini mall, and then they just go and abandon all that kind of characteristics of Kyle Reese in favor of something else. And I'm like, this is not the same Kyle Reese. This is off.
Michael Bihn's Kyle Reese, I think, was a lot more human than Jai Courtney's version,
Yeah,
which I think is why I got more attached to his version.
exactly. I think that they wrote Kyle Reese he is a plot device, and they were like maybe, but like the Jai Courtney version is just another character that they need a cool action star. Let's add more to Kyle Reese. But in doing so, they forgot the whole point of what Kyle Reese is, and they made him less human and more of a cool gun-toting future soldier, and he just kind of ends up being obnoxious.
And they kind of do the same thing with Sarah Connor in this movie. It felt as though they were trying to merge both versions from T1 and T2 together. And to be honest, she just wasn't really as fun to follow as she was in the first two.
No, and they constantly use her to explain things. Like,
Yes.
she explains the whole movie to you. You're like, guys, we're watching a movie.
Can't you just show us stuff instead of
Yeah,
always telling us?
she has to keep explaining things. Oh, the Terminators have real human skin, so he'll age. Okay, but I guess that would maybe they were just trying to get people to stop nitpicking. Like, if the Terminator does it, so what? Terminators get old now? Oh, how about the person that sent that Terminator to save Sarah? He goes, that's classified, and they never bring it up Again, we don't know who sent that T-800 back because once again, Genesis is trying to sequel bait so hard in the first 15 minutes of the movie. They're like, this is going to be a trilogy. And you're like, oh, it's way too confident in itself because in the first, I think, 20 minutes of Genesis, it's really hard to get into it.
Yeah, and once again, this is a movie that kills off John Connor, which I still don't get why these movies are so obsessed with killing off John Connor, but it also just ultimately makes him a villain, and that just really, I don't know, it just kind of cheapens his character a lot to me.
Yeah, I'm always like, it's fiction, right? You shouldn't get so worked up about it, but it's just like with the way the Terminator has dictated the type of man John Connor is, there's no way a Terminator infects him and he goes, you know what? The Terminators are right. There's just that doesn't make sense to me. He would find a way to like either resist it or eliminate himself as being a problem. Like he would find a way because he's the guy that saves humanity. And you're telling me at the end of the war, Skynet goes, Zap, you're a Terminator. And he just goes, I guess you're right. You got me. That it doesn't make sense. And I don't like it.
It doesn't do any justice to his character.
No, it doesn't. It's actually, I would say the exact opposite. It completely disrespects the character.
And like you were talking about earlier with nostalgia, a huge issue with this movie and Dark Fate, but we'll get to that soon, is that they rely too much on nostalgia and it recreates certain things from the first one, since it's an alternate timeline, like when the original Terminator arrives in 1984 and when Pops eventually confronts it. And I'm fine with references and some connections to previous movies, and this is very much just a personal thing, but the problem for me is that I don't like when sequels rely too much on previous films to exist because if you incorporate so much material and in this case nostalgia from previous entries, then it's really difficult for this movie to stand on its own and be interesting.
Yeah, it's just like first off, movie came out 2015. Now you need to get a whole new audience into Terminator, like a brand new audience. Yes, the fans from the original 1984 movie still around. Think about it. Terminator's a iconic movie franchise, but it doesn't have like a following like Star Wars. It doesn't have a Star Trek following. It doesn't have an MCU following, and it's on the same level as like Predator. Like people are like, oh, the Predator or oh, Alien. Yeah, that sounds cool, but you need to guarantee seats. And Predator, I would say, did it pretty well. Had a pretty good idea with Prey. Like, let's do Predator, but let's kind of reintroduce the concepts, but do it differently. Terminator Genisys goes, hey, you guys like the old Terminator movies, and I was not interested sold by those trailers because I had never seen a Terminator movie like fully until before then. So I was like, I don't care. This seems like I'd have to see the other movies first. It really wants you to see it, but when you watch it, you're like, I don't know how any newcomer would watch Terminator Genisys and enjoy it.
And it's unfortunate because if you didn't spend too much time trying to recreate and retcon things from the most beloved films in the franchise, I think you could have made a more interesting film.
Yeah.
But now that we've finished talking about Genesis, now moving on to the last movie, and that is Terminator Dark Fate. Max, this is the movie you've been looking forward to talking about most, right?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So Terminator Dark Fate does not understand what makes Terminator movies good. So first off, they kill off John Connor in the beginning. So humanity automatically should be doomed, but it's not doomed because what Terminator does is like, oh, if John Connor dies, then Danny becomes the leader of the resistance. So it's saying that no matter if Danny dies, then fate will pick a new leader for the resistance. I get it, but also once again, it's not how Terminator has described itself. It's John Connor is the guy that unites humanity.
It's still just another disrespect to the character of John Connor.
Yeah, it lessens his role. It makes the first two movies like pointless, and it just basically it makes the entirety idea of the Terminator, the future war, pointless because the Terminators can send as many Terminators they want back. If they kill John Connor, if they kill Danny, then the fate of the resistance leader, whoever gets that mantle, it will just keep transferring on to the next person. So it's just like who cares? Why are we fighting then? Skynet's most logical thing is to never send a Terminator back.
Well, and the thing is, they, like you said, they kill him off in the first 4 to 5 minutes, and kind of similar to how I felt about the way they killed Sarah in Terminator 3. Once John died, all I can think was, oh, just like that? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, I mean, part of why it pissed me off so much is because this was supposed to take place after Terminator 1 and 2, specifically after 2, and it felt like such a slap in the face because it sacrifices everything that we were victorious with at the end of the second movie.
Yeah. There's so much. You're telling me Sarah Connor sees a T-800 walking up on the beach, and she watches him walk by, and she doesn't immediately react. Like it's once again, it's using that logic that they're compassionate for the T-800. She logically knows that that T-800 isn't the same T-800 that saved John. Therefore, she should be alarmed and should immediately. She does not spring into action. It happens. She has at least like a moment to spring into action, but he shoots John right in front of her before she can react. But that the way the movie paints it out, it doesn't make sense. She just lets it happen, kind of.
Well, that's the thing, because when this movie first got announced, I was actually pretty excited. We found out it was going to take place after T2 and it was going to ignore all the other sequels. We found out James Cameron was going to be involved. It was going to be directed by Tim Miller, who directed Deadpool. And at first, when I heard all that, all I could think was, oh, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be exactly what the other movies should have been. But then I saw it and I was disappointed.
Yeah, I that movie. Okay, so once again, it's a rehash. The all the new characters entirely forgettable. I can't remember their names. Other than Rev 9, which is the new Terminator, but it's actually just the TX again. Just instead of turning into liquid and being a robot, it can split its form, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, but other than that, I mean, other than the fact that it can split its form, with the Rev 9, that might be one of, if not the weakest villain in the entire franchise. Like, seriously, I can't tell you anything memorable about this guy. He's just a new Terminator who's supposed to be the latest, most advanced Terminator that's ever been created, which has
Yeah,
been done so many times already. Like, we've already seen Terminators who are supposed to be the latest, best Terminator that's ever been created.
it is just the TX again. It's
Yeah,
just the TX, but instead of controlling machines, it splits its forms. Yeah, the Rev 9, the only thing about the Rev 9 is that it has the most unkillable state because there's so many instances where it would have killed a T-800 or a T-1000 and the Rev 9 survives. And that's the only thing the Rev 9 really has going for it is it's a lot more hardy or durable. But there's the girl that is clearly the new Kyle Reese, right? Blonde hair, short blonde hair, soldier from the future.
oh, that's Grace.
Yeah, Grace. She gets sent back from the future. Now, the only thing that I can think is they never go into who Grace is. I can only assume that Grace is somehow like Kyle Reese's daughter in the future because he never gets sent back. So he has a different child, and that's Grace, who ends up filling his role to save Danny. But Danny, by design, the character's presence in the story doesn't fit in the sense that the only reason she exists is that if John Connor dies, then Danny's the new leader, and now they got to kill Danny. And then Danny has to meet Sarah Connor so Sarah Connor can prepare Danny for the future war like she did with John. And then they mischaracterize Sarah Connor, who is a lot more cynical and seems a lot more resentful of her own son because Skynet sent a Terminator back to kill her before he was born. And she's really resentful about that fact. And it's weird.
Well, and speaking of Sarah and Danny as characters, so just talking about Danny, for me personally, I didn't think she was a very interesting or entertaining character to have as one of your leads. I mean, if you compare her to John Connor from Terminator 2, here's what that movie did better. John had a lot more personality and more growth as a character throughout that one, and just in my experience, Danny didn't get the best characterization, and I just couldn't get attached to her as a character because there just wasn't anything memorable about her, in my opinion.
No, because so one thing that Terminator 2 does to get you used to John is you follow him through his mischief, him hanging out with his friend, they go to the mall, and then the T-1000 catches up to them, right? Like there's a sequence of events you follow John through. You follow Danny to work, then a Terminator kills her father, and then the Terminator kills her brother.
You didn't even show us what type of character she is.
Yeah, we don't know who this person. We just know that she cares for her brother a lot, you know? That's it. That she's a somewhat caring person or a family girl and like, yeah, okay, we get that. But the craziest thing is that this movie constantly forgets the stuff it already explained. Grace shows up, saves Danny and her brother before he dies, because he dies a little bit later, but she saves them and she goes, "Who sent you?" And Grace says that you from the future sent me. And then later on in the movie, Danny asks the question, and then Grace goes, "It was you. You sent me from the future. I know you in the future." And she acts like that's a big reveal. She told you that 15 minutes into knowing her. She fully explained that to you. And then there's a scene where Sarah Connor throws Danny's phone out a window while they're driving. She goes, "Why'd you do that?" And she goes, "It's like wearing a tracking chip for the Terminators. They'll follow your phone around." And then, like, not even 4 minutes later, they're in a motel. She's digging through Sarah Connor's bags of chips, and turns out there's phones in them. And she goes, "Oh, yeah, I put phones in the tin bags of chips so the Terminators can't track them. So why did you throw Danny's phone out the window? Why didn't you put it in the Lay's bag bag with your other chips or your Ruffles bags because they were product placement. It was such a bizarre moment. I was like, and then the movie keeps forgetting things. It's like, did we go back and check the script? Like, oh, did we explain that already? It just feels like, oh, we forgot to explain that. We're gonna do that now. It's like, no, you did do that. You already did that.
Yeah, and also just speaking of Sarah Connor specifically, so I don't know if this was just intentional with how the movie is written. Maybe the idea was to make her more of a jaded hero or something, but I don't know. Every time I go back to this movie, and I don't know if this is your experience, Max, but it's kind of similar to what you were saying with Arnold in Terminator 3, how he looked like he was just there for a paycheck. Well, that's kind of how I feel about Sarah Connor in this movie because to me, every time I see her on screen, Linda Hamilton just seems bored as shit every time. And I don't know, maybe it's intentional, I have no idea, but she just always seems so uninterested with what's going on, and it's so hard to get invested in her character.
Yeah, I'm just if you said no to Terminator 3, I don't know how you said yes to Dark Fate.
I don't know, because it's the one that James Cameron was involved with.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
it would have to been by Cameron's word. It must have been like, oh, if Cameron's down with this, then I'm down with it. That's how it must be have worked logically.
Yeah, and also I gotta be honest with you, Max. Well, this movie brings back Arnold, and I honestly think Genesis did him more justice than this movie did.
Yes, you're totally right.
That might be a really unpopular opinion. I have no idea, but I liked him better in Genesis than I did in this movie.
I think he's way better in Genesis. He's like more
Entertaining.
yeah, and charismatic.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, you have him sacrifice himself at the end, which we've seen before. What annoys me though, and I don't know if this has ever been an issue for you, the way that he gets rid of the Rev 9 is pretty much exactly the same as how they got rid of the TX in Terminator 3.
Yeah.
That just always annoyed the hell out of me.
Yeah, I mean not to trot back to Genesis, but in Genesis at least when he self-sacrificed them, they spared him this time, and he just became a T-1000 in the end because he fell into the shifting metal. Yeah, it's like once again, one thing that got really old in Terminator was that the Arnold Terminator dies, and you're like, oh my God, we did it again, guys. It was cool in the first movie because he was scary. It was sad in the second movie because we got attached to him. It was rehashed in the third movie, and you're kind of like, whatever. And then in Salvation, they killed, by the way, he dies in every movie because there was a Salvation Arnold that was CGI'd. They killed that one, and then in Genesis he survives miraculously, but only after he thinks he sacrifices himself. And then they melt him again in the same fashion as it kind of as in the hangar, and he says, "Oh, for John," like that's supposed to be like some sort of that's supposed to get you. But I didn't buy it. I didn't really care that he was like, "Oh, for John, I'm doing this for John." And the fact that he killed John, went to Texas, hid with this family, like I like the interesting story arc. I don't know if I just don't understand. Like they just were like, oh, the Terminator felt bad for killing John Connor after he had got involved with this family. Like, okay, so now there's a whole new layer of complexity to Terminators because now you're saying they're way more alive than they are. They're not. They're more than just machines now. So how's that happen? But you don't explain that. You just wanted to justify why he's not an evil robot now and why he can be a good T-800 again. And it's just there. Like Dark Fate has so much stuff it just does to simply justify having actors where they are in that given moment rather than letting the narrative kind of naturally progress, which it doesn't.
Well, and just like with Genesis, it's another movie in the franchise that relies too much on nostalgia, specifically with Terminator 2. And once again, if you rely so much on nostalgia, then how does this stand on its own?
Exactly. That's something I feel like that's Hollywood. That you gotta have a shape-shifting Terminator. You gotta have Arnold Schwarzenegger. You gotta have Linda Hamilton if you can. And then you gotta make sure that if you don't want John Connor, then the Terminators have to come back and kill somebody. Or they always have to interfere with the three characters from the original movie. They either have to go after it has to be something about the Kyle Reese, John Connor, or Sarah Connor. Those are the three people that can only be targeted. And then Dark Fate tries to do it. And then you realize you're like, oh, that's why they only do Kyle Reese, Sarah Connor, or John. Because when they make a new character that gets targeted, you don't care. Now Dark Fate also just was like, it's just not Terminator 1 or 2.
Well, and apparently there were a lot of creative differences during the production and post-production process of this movie between James Cameron and director Tim Miller. And back when this movie came out, Cameron actually described those differences as a bloodbath and said, quote, the blood is still being scrubbed off the walls from those creative battles. So I think that was probably a big detriment to the film since you have these clashing visions trying to make one thing together.
Yeah. And one thing, if you look at the writing credits for Dark Fate, for a movie that has not one, not two, but three female central protagonists, not a single woman is on the credits. So like it feels like it's also written by guys who are really out of touch and think this is how people talk to each other, or this is how things should go, or this is how this logically would be. And Terminator Dark Fate, they use a bunch of talking points that just seem very out of touch. And then when you kind of look into it, you're like, oh, I could see why. It's just not very good. And it feels very, very like, oh, look, we got to bring up this talking point. We got to bring up this talking point, and we got to do this. We got to do this. And they didn't consult with anyone. This is what they wrote. And it just, these characters are not good.
They're not fun to see interact with each
They're
other.
not fun to see to interact with, and I hate like the women in this film, like these characters. I just remember thinking this feels like a movie where men were writing women with no consulting other women writers or directors or producers. And you look at it, you're like, I think that's true because Danny does not feel natural at all. Grace doesn't feel natural at all. Linda Hamilton kicks some ass, but she's Linda Hamilton. She's a veteran actress.
And she also just looks bored as shit the entire time, like I said.
But she genuinely looks uninterested with her script. She looks like she's just waiting for them to call cut. It's genuinely a painful watch.
Yeah, well, I will say this, Max, now that we've kind of reached the end of this, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, it was confirmed, I think, last year that James Cameron was in fact working on a script for a brand new Terminator film, and we don't know much about it yet, but allegedly it's going to serve as a reboot for the franchise, and it'll have brand new characters and a modern take on the storyline. With that in mind, despite how the sequels have turned out, do you think there's any chance that that movie could create some hope for the franchise? Because I am trying to be a little optimistic here, but at the same time, after six films, all I can really think is what else is there really to explore with this franchise? But what about you?
I think a Cameron-led Terminator project is the best hope for its future if we want more Terminator movies. But honestly, Terminator as a movie franchise is going to have a hard time because with the way that TV and movies work now, I'd say that Terminator would find better success in the TV sphere, like streaming services, like get an original show put together, maybe about the future war. Like that could be like an episodic TV series I think people would really like. I know Netflix, I haven't watched it, but I know Netflix has Terminator Zero, and I know that people who like Terminator say Terminator Zero isn't that bad of an anime. And I think that Terminator could find success in TV because there's more time to tell your story. And I feel like if Terminator really wants to find a new fan base, they maybe want to look into making a TV show rather than a movie because a movie gets made, it's a 2 hour affair. People don't like going to the theaters as much as they used to,
Which is unfortunate.
which is unfortunate. But it just depends. Like, where do you want to go? You know, not all my friends want to go to Apple Cinemas. Not everyone wants to go to an AMC. A lot of people do streaming, and I think that if Terminator wants to find a new fan base, they should look into getting a deal with either Netflix, Amazon, HBO Max,
Or Prime.
or Prime, yeah, or Paramount, because Paramount has some of the Terminator films. Just trying to make a TV show. I'm not saying no to another Cameron movie. I'll accept it. I think that he's a good visionary. I think he'll the Terminator movie that he wants. Because as far as I'm concerned, we just got Terminator 3, Terminator 4, Terminator 3 again, Terminator 3 again. He needs to write it, and then he needs to give it to a director that he knows can respect and understand the vision, because you don't want to do what Disney did with the Star Wars sequels, which is a whole nother can of worms. But the like problem with those movies is that they had those movies written and then they gave them to different directors who were completely different visionaries in their own respects, and it made for a really incomprehensive trilogy. And like we said, he clashed with Tim Miller on Dark Fate, and Dark Fate suffered for that. So he needs to, if he can't direct it, he should at least write it and then allow someone to do the movie, or take a break from the Avatar movies, do one Terminator, go back to Avatar. I know that that's not how contracts work. I just hope we're the best of the Terminator franchise.
Yeah, I see what you mean. All right, guys, I think that wraps up our discussion. Max, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I loved talking about Terminator.
All right, guys, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out Max's channel, and we will see you guys again soon.